I found a hidden pipeline. Beneath my own land, I inherited a 2,500-acre lake, thinking I was coming home to peace. Instead, less than 12 hours after arriving, an HOA president slapped thousands of dollars in lake access fees on my truck and claimed I owed money to use water my family had owned for generations. The deeper I dug, the stranger it got. Hidden notices, a warning from my uncle, a forgotten deed, and a secret buried beneath the lake itself that connected the HOA to something far bigger than fake fines. By the time I uncovered the truth, an entire system built over 20 years was starting to crack. So before we get into it, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy stories about standing your ground, protecting what's yours, and watching the truth come to light when nobody expects it. Now let me tell you how an HOA tried to charge the owner of the lake, and why they ended up regretting it. The first thing I noticed about Mercer Lake was how quiet it was. Not empty, not abandoned, just quiet in a way that made the rest of the world seem far away. I stood at the end of the old wooden dock with my hands in my pockets, staring across 2,500 acres of water that belonged to my family longer than Montana had been a state. The boards creaked beneath my boots. A fishing boat bobbed gently against its rope. Somewhere across the shoreline, an eagle cut across the sky. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't ringing. No project deadlines, no corporate meetings, no engineers demanding revisions, just water. My Uncle Owen had spent his entire life protecting this place. When he passed away 3 months earlier, he left everything to me: the cabin, the shoreline, the dam easements, and the lake itself. I hadn't fully processed it yet. After 20 years designing water systems across the country, inheriting a lake felt less like receiving property and more like inheriting responsibility. Still, I figured I had time. A few weeks to settle in. Maybe a month before dealing with legal paperwork. I was wrong. 12 minutes after arriving, trouble rolled up my driveway. I heard tires crunching gravel behind me. The sound was sharp enough to pull me away from the water. A black Cadillac Escalade came down the narrow road and stopped beside my truck. The vehicle looked completely out of place next to the weathered cabin and pine trees. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Perfect blonde hair, designer sunglasses, tailored blazer, not a speck of dust on her shoes despite the gravel road. She carried a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, the kind of person who looked more comfortable inside a boardroom than beside a Montana lake. She walked directly toward me without introducing herself. "You Caleb Mercer?" Her voice wasn't rude. It was worse. Confident. The kind of confidence that assumed the answer didn't matter. "That's me." She glanced at the cabin, then at the dock, then back at me. So the inheritance finally went through. Something about the way she said it made me straighten slightly. "You knew my uncle?" Her smile was thin. I knew of him. Not the same thing. Before I could ask another question, she pulled a thick stack of papers from her clipboard and slapped them against the windshield of my truck. The sound echoed across the shoreline. I stared at her, then at the paperwork, then back at her. What exactly is this? Notice of violation. She said it casually, like she was telling me the weather forecast. I grabbed the stack. There were dozens of pages. Violation notices, fee schedules, late penalties, compliance demands. The numbers got larger every time I turned a page. $3,000, $7,000, $11,000. My eyes narrowed. What am I looking at? She folded her arms. Unpaid lake access fees. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it didn't make sense. Lake access fees. Correct. I looked toward the water, then back at her. This lake? Mercer Lake. I waited. She didn't smile. She wasn't joking. You mean the lake my family owns? Her expression never changed. As president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association, I'm informing you that these fees are now your responsibility. I looked down again. The documents claimed decades of unpaid assessments, environmental maintenance charges, shoreline management contributions, water access usage fees. Some of them stretched back years before I had even visited the property. I flipped through several pages. This says my uncle owed these. He did. He never paid them. No. Then why are you bringing them to me now? For the first time, her smile returned. Because now there was someone to collect from. Answer sat there between us. Cold. Calculated. My patience started thinning. Let's clear something up. I tapped the papers. My uncle owned this lake. According to your understanding, yes. My understanding? I stared at her. What does that mean? She removed her sunglasses. The expression underneath wasn't uncertainty. It was certainty. The dangerous kind. The HOA manages the lake. No. We absolutely do. No, you absolutely don't. Her jaw tightened. Mine did too. The water behind us suddenly felt a lot farther away. I think there's been some confusion, I said. There hasn't. The Mercer family has owned this lake for generations. Your family owns property adjacent to a community-managed water resource. I blinked, then blinked again, because I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. A community-managed what? Water resource. I pointed toward the shoreline. The entire lake? Correct. I shook my head slowly. No. She nodded. Yes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The situation had become so absurd that I wasn't sure where to begin. Then I noticed something. She wasn't explaining. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't trying to convince me. She already believed she'd won. That bothered me more than the paperwork. People bluff all the time, but bluffers usually show cracks. She showed none, which meant one of two things. Either she was incredibly stupid, or she thought she had something backing her up. Something real. What was your name again? Linda Ashford. The way she said it suggested I should recognize it. Maybe everyone around here did. I didn't. Well, Linda, here's the problem. I held up the papers. I don't owe lake access fees for my own lake. Failure to comply triggers additional penalties. I don't care. Liens can also be pursued. That got my attention. Not because I believed her. Because she sounded prepared. Too prepared. Almost rehearsed. You're threatening a lien? I'm explaining procedure. Against property that's been in my family for over a century. I'm explaining procedure. There it was again. The confidence, the certainty, the complete absence of hesitation. She took another paper from her clipboard. Bright red. Stamped final notice. Then she slid it beneath the windshield wiper. You have 30 days. For what? to come into compliance. I stared at her. Compliance with what? Community regulations. The answer made even less sense than the first one. I watched her turn and walk back toward the Escalade. No argument, no debate, no discussion, just a woman delivering orders she assumed would be followed. The vehicle pulled away in a cloud of dust. Within seconds, she disappeared around the bend. Silence returned. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. I looked down at the stack of papers in my hands. Thousands of dollars in fees, threats, violations, references to regulations I'd never heard of. At the top of one page sat a logo, Lakeshore Estates, HOA. Below it, Outstanding Lake Access Assessments. I laughed again, short, humorless. Then I stopped. Because something about this felt wrong. Not mistaken. Wrong. A simple misunderstanding could be corrected with a phone call. This felt different. Organized. Intentional. Like somebody had been doing this for a very long time. I looked across the water. My uncle had spent 50 years protecting this lake. He wasn't the kind of man who forgot paperwork. He wasn't the kind of man who ignored threats. So why had Linda Ashford arrived within minutes of my return? Why did she already have years of records prepared? And why was she so certain she could charge the owner of the entire lake? Standing there beside the dock, holding thousands of dollars in demands, I realized something. Linda Ashford hadn't come to introduce herself. She'd come to establish control. The question was why? And I had a feeling the answer was buried somewhere my uncle never wanted me to stop looking. I carried Linda Ashford's stack of violations into the cabin and spread them across the kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Every page told the same story. Fees, penalties, warnings, threats. The dates caught my attention first. Some notices were recent. Others stretched back years. A few referenced balances older than a decade. That didn't make sense. If my uncle really owed this money, why hadn't they collected it already? I started flipping through the pages more carefully. Halfway through the stack, I noticed something strange. Several notices referenced previous violations. Violations that weren't included. Missing records. Missing years. Missing explanations. It looked less like a complete file and more like pieces of one. That bothered me. My Uncle Owen wasn't a hoarder, but he never threw away paperwork. Especially paperwork tied to land. Especially paperwork tied to this lake. If these people had been sending him demands for years, copies had to be somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The attic sat beneath the cabin's steep roofline. I'd been up there plenty of times as a kid. Back then it felt enormous. Now it felt crowded. Rows of boxes lined the rafters. Fishing gear, survey maps, tax records, maintenance, receipts. Everything carefully labeled in my uncle's neat handwriting. I started opening boxes. The first held old photographs. The second contained decades of utility bills. The third was filled with lake maintenance records, nothing. Then I found a box marked simply HOA. My pulse picked up. I pulled it closer and lifted the lid. The box was packed, not with a few documents. Hundreds, violation notices, collection demands, fee schedules, certified mail receipts, 20 years' worth. I sat down hard on the attic floor. Linda hadn't started this fight. She'd inherited it. The earliest letter was dated nearly 2 decades ago. The wording sounded familiar. Unpaid lake assessments, environmental maintenance contributions, community access fees, the same nonsense she'd handed me this morning. I dug deeper. Almost every notice carried one thing in common: a stamp. Rejected. My uncle had marked them himself. Every single one. He hadn't paid. Not once. I kept searching. Near the bottom sat an old envelope folded in half. Postage. No address. Just my name written across the front. Caleb. My stomach tightened. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. If you're reading this, they finally came after you. Don't argue with them. Don't negotiate. Don't pay them. Find the original grant. They'll come for the water. Don't let them. Uncle Owen and I read it twice, then a third time. The words refused to settle. They'll come for the water, not the cabin, not the land, not the shoreline, the water. A chill worked through me. Because suddenly Linda's confidence made more sense. She wasn't acting like someone collecting fees. She was acting like someone protecting an operation. The sound of my phone ringing snapped me out of it. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I answered. This is Caleb. Caleb Mercer? Yeah. This is Sheriff Tom Raines. I sat up straighter. Everything all right, Sheriff? There was a pause. I heard you had a visit from Linda Ashford. News traveled fast. That obvious? Sheba called the station an hour ago. That got my attention. What for? To inform us she'd initiated compliance enforcement against a non-cooperative property owner. I laughed. The sheriff didn't. Listen carefully, Caleb. His tone changed. More serious. How long are you planning to stay out there? I inherited the place. Permanent. Another pause. Then you should know something. I waited. People around here don't challenge Linda. Why? Because challenging her gets expensive. The sheriff's voice remained calm. 3 families sold within the last 5 years after disputes with the HOA. What kind of disputes? Fees, violations, liens, inspection complaints. I looked down at the papers scattered around me. She forced them out? Never directly. That answer said everything. The sheriff continued. She knows exactly how much pressure most people can take. And if they can't, they leave. I thought about my uncle's note. Find the original grant. What about my uncle? The sheriff hesitated. Owen Mercer was different. How? Because she never beat him. I froze. What do you mean? For 20 years, she kept sending notices. The sheriff lowered his voice. And for 20 years, she never pushed beyond paperwork. That stopped me cold. Linda Ashford threatened liens, threatened enforcement, threatened penalties. Yet somehow she'd never actually moved against Owen Mercer. Why? Because she couldn't? Or because she was afraid of something? What aren't you telling me, Sheriff? The line stayed quiet for several seconds. Finally, he answered. I don't know exactly what your uncle had. What do you mean? I just know Linda never acted this aggressively while he was alive. My eyes drifted toward the note in my hand. Find the original grant. The sheriff spoke again. Whatever she wants, Caleb. It's bigger than fees. The call ended a few minutes later. I sat alone in the attic. The cabin suddenly felt different. The papers around me weren't random complaints. They were evidence. 20 years of evidence. And somewhere inside all of it was a reason. A reason Linda Ashford had waited until the day I arrived. A reason she thought ownership didn't matter. A reason my uncle left me a warning instead of an explanation. I carefully placed the note back into its envelope. Then I looked deeper into the box. Beneath the notices sat something I hadn't noticed before. An old brass key. Attached to it was a faded tag. 3 handwritten words. Original grant storage. I stared at it. Then at the thousands of violation notices surrounding me. Then back at the key. For 20 years, my uncle had been waiting for someone to find it. The question wasn't whether the original grant existed. The question was what was hidden inside it that had kept Linda Ashford afraid for 2 decades. And for the first time since arriving at Mercer Lake, I wasn't thinking about the fees anymore. I was thinking about the water. The brass key sat on the kitchen table beside my uncle's note. Original grant storage. I turned it over several times, looking for clues. Nothing. No address. No instructions. Just the key. By sunrise, I had already made 2 decisions. First, I wasn't calling Linda Ashford. Second, I needed someone who understood property law better than I did. 3 hours later, I walked into Grace Holloway's office. The building sat above a hardware store in town. Nothing flashy, no marble floors, no giant reception desk, just shelves packed with legal books and decades of case files. Grace looked up from her desk when I entered carrying a box of documents. "You must be Caleb Mercer. You know who I am?" She smiled. "In a town this size, everyone knows who you are." I set the box down. "And let me guess, everyone knows Linda Ashford, too." The smile disappeared. Unfortunately. That answer told me enough. For the next hour, I laid everything out. The HOA notices. My uncle's note. The rejected fee demands. The brass key. Grace moved through the documents methodically. By the time she reached the 10th notice, her expression had changed. By the 20th, she was frowning. By the 50th, she stopped entirely. "This is unusual." "How unusual?" She held up one of the notices. "Most HOAs either collect or sue. I assume Linda likes both." Grace shook her head. "That's the thing. I don't see evidence she ever did either." That matched what Sheriff Raines had said. 20 years of threats. No actual enforcement. I leaned forward. "Why?" Grace tapped the paper. "Because if she believed she had authority, she'd have pushed this into court years ago." The room fell quiet. That thought landed hard. Linda acted confident, aggressive, certain, yet somehow she'd avoided the one place certainty gets tested. A courtroom. Grace pulled another notice from the pile. This one references community lake management rights. So I've never seen those rights recorded. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means I need to check the county filings. For the next hour, she disappeared into public records databases, property maps, land filings, water district registrations, corporate records. I watched her work. Every few minutes, she'd type something else into the system. Every few minutes, her expression grew more concerned. Finally, she leaned back. Interesting. I hated that word. Lawyers only said interesting when something was about to become complicated. What? The HOA owns roads. Okay. They own common areas. Okay. They own several shoreline easements. I waited. They do not own Mercer Lake. Not a surprise. But hearing it from an attorney mattered. Could they still regulate it? Not from anything I'm seeing. I felt my shoulders loosen slightly. For the first time since Linda arrived, reality was starting to catch up with her claims. Then Grace frowned again. What? She turned the monitor toward me. Look at this. The screen displayed years of county filings. Permit requests, infrastructure applications, environmental review documents. Most referenced lakeshore estates. Some referenced shoreline projects. But none referenced ownership of the lake itself. Nothing. It was as if the HOA operated around the water while carefully avoiding any official statement about controlling it. That seems deliberate. Grace nodded. Very. A knock interrupted us. The receptionist stepped inside. Grace, there's someone asking for Mr. Mercer. My stomach tightened. Who? Didn't give a name. I followed her downstairs. Outside, a white SUV sat near the curb. The driver's door opened. Linda Ashford stepped out. Of course. She smiled when she saw me. The same smile she'd worn at the lake. The smile of someone used to getting her way. Mr. Mercer. What do you want? She glanced toward Grace's office window. Legal advice already? I didn't answer. Linda folded her arms. I came to offer a professional courtesy. Funny way to show it. Her smile tightened. You've inherited obligations you don't understand. No, I inherited a lake. You inherited a situation. There it was again. That confidence, that certainty. Like she knew something I didn't. I decided to test it. Tell me something, Linda. Sure. If the HOA owns the lake, why isn't it listed in county records? For the first time, a crack appeared. Tiny, barely visible, but it was there. Her eyes shifted, just for a second. Then she recovered. Ownership isn't the issue. Interesting. Not ownership. Control. Then what is the issue? You need to comply. I almost laughed. Every answer eventually led back to the same threat. Fees. Compliance. Authority. Yet never proof. Never evidence. Just demands. Linda stepped closer. You should stop digging. The sentence hit differently than the others. Because it wasn't about fees. It wasn't about regulations. It sounded personal. I stared at her. What exactly am I digging into? She smiled again, but this time it looked forced. You'll find out. Then she walked back to her SUV. The vehicle disappeared down Main Street moments later. I remained standing on the sidewalk. Watching. Thinking. Because something had just changed. When Linda first arrived at the lake, she'd acted like a collector. Now she sounded like a gatekeeper, someone protecting information, someone worried about what I might discover. I headed back upstairs. Grace was waiting. Well, she told me to stop digging. Grace's eyebrows rose. That's never a good sign. No. I sat down across from her desk. Tell me what you're really thinking. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she opened a folder she'd created from the morning's research. I think your uncle knew something. I nodded. So do I. And I think Linda knows what it is. What makes you say that? Grace tapped the stack of notices. Because none of this feels like collection. She pointed toward the records on her screen. It feels like pressure. Pressure. The word fit perfectly. 20 years of pressure. 20 years of intimidation. 20 years of trying to force something. The question was what? Then my eyes drifted toward the brass key original grant. Storage. My uncle's note echoed in my head. Find the original grant. Grace followed my gaze. Whatever that key opens, she said quietly, I think it's the reason this entire fight exists. And suddenly, I wasn't interested in the HOA notices anymore. I wasn't interested in Linda's threats. I wasn't even interested in the fees. I wanted to know what was hidden behind that key. Because if Linda Ashford was willing to spend 20 years pressuring the Mercer family, whatever waited behind that lock was powerful enough to scare her. And I intended to find it. I drove back to the cabin before sunset. The brass key never left my pocket. Neither did my uncle's note. Find the original grant. The problem was figuring out where the storage was. I spent 2 hours searching every room in the cabin. Nothing. No safe. No lockbox. No hidden compartment. I was beginning to wonder if the key opened something outside the house when I noticed a detail I'd overlooked. A small brass plate mounted beneath my uncle's desk tone. Old, scratched, easy to miss. 3 words. Grant Records Archive. My pulse jumped. I crouched and examined the desk more closely. The bottom drawer looked normal, until I removed it completely. Behind it sat a narrow steel door hidden inside the desk itself. A lock waited in the center. Exactly the size of the brass key. I inserted it, turned. The lock clicked immediately. For a moment I simply stared. 20 years of HOA pressure. 20 years of threats. 20 years of unanswered questions. All of it had led to this. I pulled the compartment open. Inside sat a leather folio wrapped in oilcloth. Nothing else. No money, no jewelry, no family heirlooms. Just documents. The thing Linda Ashford seemed to fear most. I carried the folio to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. The first page stopped me cold. State of Montana. Territorial Water Rights Grant. My eyes moved across the faded ink, then back again. And again. I wasn't misunderstanding it. The language was clear. The Mercer family possessed ownership, rights to Mercer Lake, including the lakebed, shoreline boundaries, watershed controls, inflow channels, and water management structures. Not usage rights. Ownership. Complete ownership. I immediately called Grace Holloway. An hour later, she was sitting across from me, reading the same document. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she looked up and laughed. What? This is extraordinary. My heart was already racing. How extraordinary? She turned another page. The answer came slowly. Most lakefront owners possess access rights. Okay. Some own portions of shoreline. Okay. She tapped the document. Your family owns the entire lake. I sat back. Even knowing it was ours, hearing it stated that plainly felt different, more real, more powerful. Grace continued reading. Then she stopped abruptly. What? She slid the page across the table. A highlighted section caught my attention. Permanent exclusion from future municipal, association, community, or private governance claims. I read it twice, then a third time. You're telling me, yes. She didn't let me finish. This document specifically prevents organizations like an HOA from claiming authority over the lake. The room fell silent. Not because the answer surprised me, because it explained everything. Linda hadn't been trying to collect fees. She'd been trying to bury this document. For 20 years. My uncle had known it. That's why he never paid. That's why he never lost. Because legally, the HOA had no jurisdiction over Mercer Lake at all. Grace turned another page, then another. The deeper she went, the more serious she became. Finally, she closed the folio. There's something else. My stomach tightened. What? She held up one of Linda's notices. Every fee they've charged references Lake Management Authority. So, if this deed is valid, and it appears absolutely valid, they never had that authority. I stared at her. The implication landed instantly. The HOA hadn't merely overreached. They had built an entire fee structure around rights they didn't possess. How much money are we talking about? Grace looked at the stack of notices. Over 20 years? She shook her head. Possibly millions. The number hit like a punch. Millions collected from residents. Millions justified through authority they never legally had. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fight wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't even about my uncle. How many people had paid these fees because they believed the HOA controlled the lake? How many families had been pressured into compliance? A knock at the front door interrupted us. Sharp. Urgent. 3 knocks. Grace and I exchanged looks. Then I opened the door. A courier stood outside. Caleb Mercer? That's me. He handed me a certified envelope. I signed, opened it immediately. Inside was another notice from Linda Ashford. Violation, escalation, additional penalties, daily fines. Grace read over my shoulder, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because the timing was absurd. They don't know. What? She pointed toward the folio. They don't know you found it. For the first time since this started, I smiled. Because she was right. Linda was still operating from the same playbook. Pressure, threats, intimidation. She thought I was cornered. She thought I was guessing. She thought I was still searching. She had no idea the search was over. The answer sat on my kitchen table, and it was older than Montana itself. Grace carefully placed the deed back into the folio. We need copies. Tomorrow. We also need to preserve chain of custody. Tomorrow. She nodded. Then her expression hardened. After that, we challenge everything. The words hung in the air. Everything. The fees, the notices, the authority, the entire foundation of Linda Ashford's control. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but legally. And legal power lasts longer than fear. After Grace left, I stood on the dock with the folio tucked beneath my arm. The lake stretched into darkness, quiet, patient, waiting. My uncle hadn't left me a weapon. He'd left me proof. Proof that the HOA never owned the lake. Proof that Linda Ashford had spent decades enforcing rules she couldn't legally enforce. But one question remained. If they never owned the lake, then where had all those fees gone? That question stayed with me all night. By morning, Grace had already filed formal notices preserving the Mercer deed and challenging any HOA claim over the lake. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. It was something simpler. A warning. The days of intimidation were over. Now there would be documentation. I expected Linda Ashford to respond. I didn't expect her to respond that fast. At 8:15 that morning, the first county truck rolled onto my property. At 8:22, a second one arrived. At 8:30, a third. 3 vehicles, 3 departments, 3 clipboards. I stepped onto the porch as the drivers climbed out. A building inspector, an environmental compliance officer, a septic systems evaluator. The lineup looked almost rehearsed. The building inspector approached first. Caleb Mercer. That's me. He checked his clipboard. We received multiple complaints regarding unsafe shoreline structures. The environmental officer stepped forward. We received reports of erosion violations. The septic inspector added his own, and potential groundwater contamination. I looked at all 3, then I laughed. None of them looked amused. You boys happen to receive those complaints from the same person? No one answered, which was answer enough. The inspections began. They checked the dock, the shoreline, the drainage systems, the retaining walls, the septic field. Everything. I followed the entire process. Recording, taking notes, asking questions. Because one thing 20 years as an engineer teaches you is simple. Documentation matters. 3 hours later, the mood had changed. The inspectors weren't finding violations. They were finding the opposite. The dock exceeded safety requirements. The retaining walls were solid. The drainage controls worked perfectly. Even the septic inspector looked annoyed. He walked toward me carrying a report. System passed every metric. No contamination? No. Contamination. Structural issues? No. Erosion. The environmental officer answered that one. Not even close. I nodded. Because I already knew. My uncle maintained this place obsessively. The complaints were fiction. The question was whether the inspectors realized it. Apparently, they did. The building inspector finally lowered his clipboard. Mr. Mercer. Yeah? Off the record? I waited. This isn't the first time we've been sent out here. That got my attention. To this property? He nodded. Over the years, I glanced toward the lake. By Linda Ashford? He didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The silence told me enough. Another vehicle appeared near the road. This one I recognized. Sheriff Tom Raines. He parked beside the county trucks and stepped out. The inspectors visibly relaxed. Interesting. Tom walked over. Looks busy. Apparently my lake is collapsing. The sheriff smirked. Seems to be holding together. The environmental officer handed him a copy of the findings. Tom scanned it, then looked at me. 0 violations. 0. The sheriff folded the report. Funny. What is? He reached into his truck, and removed a folder. Every complaint filed this morning came from the same phone number. I felt my jaw tighten. Let me guess. Tom nodded. You don't have to. The sheriff opened the folder. There were 3 complaints today. He flipped a page. 13 last month. Another page. 22 in the previous 6 months. I stared at him. Against who? Residents who challenged HOA decisions. That answer landed hard. This wasn't enforcement. It was a strategy. Pressure, fear, paperwork, inspections. Keep people busy long enough and eventually they give up. The same pattern I'd already seen in the attic. The same pattern my uncle had endured. Tom closed the folder. Linda's escalating. So am I. The sheriff studied me carefully. Found something, didn't you? I didn't answer immediately. Then I pulled a certified copy of the deed from my truck. Tom read the first page. His eyebrows rose, then higher. Finally, he handed it back. Well, yeah. That explains a lot. The inspectors gathered around. None of them spoke, but every one of them understood what they were looking at. Ownership. Real ownership. Not HOA paperwork, not community regulations. Actual legal ownership. The building inspector finally shook his head. So the HOA doesn't control the lake? No. The environmental officer looked toward the water, then, why do they keep acting like they do? That was the same question I couldn't stop asking. And I still didn't have the answer. Not completely, but I was getting closer. After the inspectors left, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing everything again. The deed, the notices, the inspection reports. Patterns started appearing. Every complaint, every violation, every threat. They all pointed toward one thing. The lake. Not the cabin. Not the property. The lake itself. Grace arrived shortly after noon. I filled her in. She listened carefully, then spread the HOA notices across the table. Look at this. She pointed toward several documents. I leaned closer. The language repeated constantly. Lake management, water protection, environmental oversight, community water administration. The same phrases appeared again and again, almost like someone was building a paper trail. I looked up. You think they're setting something up? Grace nodded. I think they've been setting it up for years. A chill moved through me. Because suddenly the inspection war made sense. The fees made sense. The pressure made sense. Someone wasn't just trying to control Mercer Lake. Someone needed to control Mercer Lake. And people don't spend 20 years building fake authority unless something valuable is hidden underneath it. Grace gathered the documents into a neat stack. Caleb. What? If Linda's willing to weaponize county inspections, she's scared. That surprised me. Scared? Absolutely. She tapped the deed. Because she knows what this means. I looked at the lake through the cabin window. The answer was out there somewhere. Not in the paperwork, not in the threats, in the water itself. And for the first time, I started wondering whether the real secret wasn't hidden in a document. Maybe it was hidden somewhere along the shoreline. Somewhere my uncle spent decades protecting. Somewhere Linda Ashford desperately didn't want me looking. The question was where, and I was about to find out. The next morning, I spread my uncle's survey maps across the kitchen table. Most people would have seen a mess of faded lines and handwritten notes. I saw something different. Patterns. For 20 years, I had designed water systems, reservoirs, flow controls, intake structures. Water always left clues, and one note kept catching my eye. Control valve 1. The words were circled twice, unlike everything else on the map, almost like my uncle wanted someone to notice it. By noon, I was following an old trail east of the lake. The path narrowed between pine trees before opening into a rocky clearing. And there it was. A rusted iron assembly protruding from the ground, partially hidden by brush, partially buried by time. I knelt beside it. The cast iron wheel carried an engraving. Mercer Water Control. I felt a strange satisfaction. The system was real. The deed wasn't just paper. My family had built infrastructure to manage the lake more than a century ago. I brushed away dirt and debris. Then I noticed something else. A faint vibration, barely noticeable. But there. Water pressure, moving beneath the ground. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the direction. I unpacked a portable sensor kit from my truck. Tools I hadn't touched since leaving engineering. 10 minutes later, the readings appeared. My stomach tightened. The pressure was wrong. Water wasn't simply entering and leaving the lake naturally. Something was pulling it. Hard. I recalibrated. Same result. Checked again. Same result. There was a significant draw somewhere downstream. Too large to be residential. Too consistent to be seasonal. Someone was taking water. A lot of it. And they weren't supposed to be. I followed the shoreline for nearly an hour. The readings kept strengthening. Every measurement pointed toward the western ridge, the same area where several luxury developments overlooked the lake. I was checking another sensor when a voice called from behind me. "You must be Owen's nephew." I turned. An older woman stood beside a fishing chair near the water. Gray hair, weathered face, sharp eyes, the kind of person who notices everything. "I am." She nodded. Martha Keene. The name sounded familiar. My uncle had mentioned her before. "Nice to meet you." She glanced at the equipment in my hands. "Checking water flow?" That surprised me. "You know what this is?" She laughed softly. "Your uncle used to carry the same gadgets." "Interesting. What was he looking for?" The smile disappeared. "The same thing you're looking for." I waited. Martha pointed toward the western ridge. He never trusted the people over there. The HOA. Not just them. Her eyes narrowed. There was a developer. Now she had my full attention. What developer? Victor Lang. The name meant nothing to me. Martha clearly expected otherwise. He tried buying water access years ago. My pulse quickened. What happened? Owen told him no. Simple answer. But not a simple story. Then what? He kept coming back. I looked toward the ridge. What did he want? The lake. Not shoreline, not property, the lake. The answer hung between us. Martha reeled in her fishing line slowly. Victor always said whoever controlled the water controlled everything. I felt a chill. Because suddenly pieces started connecting. The HOA, the fees, the inspections, the pressure. Maybe this had never been about enforcement. Maybe it had always been about acquisition. I thanked Martha and continued following the readings. The farther west I moved, the stronger they became. Then I found it. Not the entire system, just enough. A disturbed patch of ground hidden beneath brush, fresh compared to everything around it. Too straight, too deliberate. I cleared away branches. Metal. A buried access cover. My pulse jumped. I removed the lid. Black piping disappeared underground. Industrial grade. Large diameter. Not something a homeowner installs. Not something hidden by accident. I stared into the opening. Someone had built a pipeline, and based on the pressure data, it was actively drawing water from Mercer Lake, without permission, without rights, without ownership. I took photographs from every angle, measurements, coordinates, everything. Then I called Grace. 20 minutes later, she answered. "You sound excited." "I found something." "How bad?" I looked at the pipeline. Bad enough that Linda Ashford's fee scam may be the smallest problem we have. Silence. Then, "What did you find?" "Water diversion system." The silence became much longer. Finally, Grace spoke. "Caleb." "Yeah?" "If that pipeline is connected to the lake, whoever built it needed permits." "I know. And if they didn't have rights to the water?" "I know." She exhaled. "I'll start checking records." I ended the call and stared at the ridge. Somewhere beyond those trees sat Victor Lang's luxury development. Somewhere beyond those trees was the reason the HOA had spent 20 years pretending to control a lake they never owned. The pressure readings weren't lying. Water was leaving Mercer Lake. The only question now was where it was going, and who was making money from it. Because for the first time, I could see the outline of the real fight. Linda Ashford wasn't the destination. She was the gatekeeper. The path led somewhere bigger, somewhere more expensive, somewhere hidden behind money, permits, and influence. And I had a feeling the name Victor Lang was about to become very important. I didn't wait for Grace's research. The moment I got back to the cabin, I downloaded the sensor data from the pipeline site and overlaid it with my uncle's survey maps. The results were immediate. The pressure draw wasn't random. It followed a direct path west, straight toward Lang Ridge Resort, Victor Lang's newest luxury development. I zoomed in. Then again. The route lined up almost perfectly. Someone had buried a private water system beneath public assumptions. And if my calculations were right, Mercer Lake was feeding it every day. My phone rang. "Grace, tell me you found something." "I found a lot." Her voice carried a different energy. Focused, sharp, dangerous. Victor Lang owns 6 developments around the county. Okay. 3 of them list water infrastructure partnerships. I sat forward. With who? There was a pause. Then, Lakeshore Estates, HOA. That answer hit harder than I expected. The HOA wasn't standing beside Victor Lang. It was standing with him. I grabbed a notebook. How many partnerships? Enough to make me uncomfortable. Grace continued. I also found permits, referencing environmental maintenance projects funded through HOA assessments. The words sounded harmless, until you translated them. Assessments meant fees. Fees meant money. Money meant residents. The same residence Linda had been charging for years. Grace. Yeah? What if those fees paid for the pipeline? Silence. Then, that's exactly what I'm starting to think. An hour later, she arrived at the cabin carrying 2 folders. One contained permit records. The other contained HOA financial disclosures, or at least the disclosures residents were allowed to see. We spread everything across the kitchen table. The pattern emerged quickly. Water preservation fee, lake protection assessment, environmental stabilization contribution, different names, same destination, money, thousands of dollars every year, collected from homeowners. The problem was where it went afterward. Several payments were routed to consulting companies neither of us recognized. Others referenced environmental contractors with no physical addresses. Grace circled 3 names. I checked these. And they don't exist. I looked up. What do you mean they don't exist? I mean there are no business licenses, no registrations, no tax filings. The room went quiet. Because fake companies only exist for one reason: to hide real money. Grace slid another document toward me. A permit application. Approved 3 years earlier. Project description: Regional Water Sustainability Infrastructure. Applicant: Lang Ridge Development Group. Supporting organization: Lakeshore Estates, HOA. There it was. In black and white. The connection: Victor Lang. Linda Ashford. The lake, all tied together. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't about fees. No. This wasn't about rules. No. Grace tapped the permit. This was about financing. A cold realization settled over the room. Residents hadn't just been paying unnecessary fees. They had been funding something. Something expensive. Something hidden, something buried beneath the pines. The pipeline. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sheriff Tom Raines. You sitting down? Depends. You need to be. That got my attention. What happened? I ran the contractor attached to Lang's permit. I looked at Grace. She was already listening. Tom continued. The company dissolved 2 months after construction finished. That's suspicious. It gets worse. I waited. The registered mailing address belonged to an HOA board member. The room fell silent. Grace closed her eyes. I stared at the permit. The sheriff wasn't describing coincidence. He was describing coordination. Tom. Yeah? How deep do you think this goes? His answer came immediately, deeper than Linda. That matched what I was beginning to suspect. Linda wasn't the architect. She was the manager. The face residents saw. The person who delivered notices, collected fees, issued threats. But people don't build hidden pipelines alone. People don't move millions in infrastructure money alone. Someone bigger sat behind her, and his name kept appearing everywhere. Victor Lang. As evening approached, I returned to the pipeline site, needed one more look, one more confirmation. The buried access hatch sat exactly where I'd left it. I removed the cover, shined a flashlight inside, and noticed something new. A manufacturer plate attached to the main line. Lang Ridge Utilities, installed by contract. 3 years ago. There was no more doubt. The lake wasn't being monitored. It was being harvested. And somebody had spent years building an entire HOA narrative to keep people from asking questions. I photographed everything. Every bolt, every serial number, every marking. Evidence, real evidence. The kind that survives arguments, the kind that survives court. When I got back to the cabin, Grace was waiting on the porch. She looked up from her laptop. You were right. About what? The money. I stopped. What money? She turned the screen toward me. A series of financial transfers filled the display. HOA accounts, vendor payments, consulting fees, construction reimbursements, all moving toward the same network, and eventually toward Lang-owned entities. My stomach tightened. How long? Grace didn't answer immediately. Then, at least 7 years. 7 years. 7 years of fees. 7 years of false authority. 7 years of funding a pipeline that never should have existed. I looked across Mercer Lake. The water reflected the fading light. Calm. Silent. Unaware of the fight surrounding it. But that calm wasn't going to last. Because for the first time we knew what the HOA had really been doing. Not managing the lake. Exploiting it. And the evidence was finally starting to point somewhere concrete. Toward Victor Lang. Toward the money. Toward the truth. The only question left was how far they were willing to go to protect it. I got my answer the next morning. An envelope sat beneath the windshield wiper of my truck. No postage, no return address, just a Lakeshore Estates HOA seal stamped across the front. Inside was a single notice. Emergency Community Meeting. Agenda. Temporary environmental control of Mercer Lake. I read the line twice, then a third time. Temporary. Control. They weren't hiding it anymore. The HOA was openly attempting to take authority over the lake, not through ownership, not through law, through fear. I immediately called Grace. Her reaction was instant. They're panicking. Looks like it. No, Caleb. Think about the timing. She was right. The deed had surfaced. The pipeline had been discovered. The financial links were emerging. And suddenly, the HOA wanted emergency control. This wasn't administration. It was damage control. By noon, Grace and Sheriff Tom Raines and I were sitting around my kitchen table reviewing strategy. Stacks of documents covered every available surface. The deed, the pipeline photographs, the permit records, the financial transfers. Tom studied the meeting notice. They'll try to frame this as an environmental emergency. Grace nodded. They need residents scared. Why? Because scared people stop asking questions. The answer was simple and effective. If residents believed the lake was in danger, they might support almost anything, even handing control to people who had no legal right to it. I looked at the notice again. Meeting time, 7 p.m. Location, Lakeshore Community Pavilion. The fight was coming into the open. For the first time, everything would happen in public. By 7 o'clock, the pavilion was packed. Residents filled every chair. Others stood along the walls. I recognized several faces from around the lake. Retirees, families, small business owners, people who had spent years paying whatever the HOA demanded. At the front of the room stood Linda Ashford. Confident, composed, prepared, large presentation boards surrounded her. Charts, graphs, photographs of shorelines, water-level projections, everything designed to look official. Victor Lang sat 2 seats away, the first time I'd seen him in person. Expensive suit, controlled expression, The kind of man who looked comfortable letting other people do his dirty work. Several local reporters occupied the back row, cameras already rolling. Good. Let them record everything. Linda stepped to the microphone. The room quieted. Thank you all for attending on short notice. Her voice carried easily, as many of you know, Mercer Lake is facing significant environmental uncertainty. The lie arrived immediately. No hesitation, no concern, just confidence. She clicked a remote. A graph appeared behind her. Our consultants have identified potential risks involving shoreline management, water regulation, and long-term sustainability. Consultants. The same fake consultants tied to the permits. The same names Grace couldn't verify. I watched residents exchange worried looks. Linda continued. To protect homeowners, the board proposes temporary environmental oversight authority until these issues are resolved. There it was. The seizure attempt. Wrapped in softer language. Temporary oversight. Environmental protection. Community safety. Same goal, different words. Victor sat silently beside her. Watching. Waiting. Grace leaned toward me. She's building a narrative. I know. Let her. That surprised me. Grace's eyes never left the stage. She's about to overplay her hand. Linda clicked another slide. This one displayed photographs of my dock. My property. My shoreline. Without permission. Without context. Unfortunately, she continued, certain property owners have resisted cooperation. Several people turned toward me. Exactly as Linda intended. I stood. The room immediately grew quieter. Linda's expression tightened. Mr. Mercer, you'll have an opportunity later. No. I stepped into the aisle. I think now works better. A few people laughed. Not many. But enough. I walked toward the front, carrying a leather folder, the same one that contained the deed. Tom followed. Grace followed. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Tension, expectation, fear, all mixing together. Linda gripped the podium. This meeting follows community procedures. Great, I said. Then let's discuss facts. The room went silent. I placed a certified copy of the Mercer deed on the presentation table. Several reporters immediately moved closer. Cameras zoomed in. Linda's eyes locked onto the document. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not angry, not annoyed. Uncomfortable. Grace stepped beside me. This document establishes ownership of Mercer Lake, its watershed, shoreline rights, and water control infrastructure. Residents began whispering. The sound spread through the room. Linda tried to interrupt. Grace didn't let her. It also, explicitly excludes future HOA jurisdiction. That stopped the room cold. Even Victor looked up. People weren't whispering anymore. They were staring. Linda recovered quickly. Ownership doesn't eliminate environmental responsibilities. No, Grace agreed. But it eliminates your authority. A ripple moved through the audience. The power dynamic had shifted, publicly, for the first time. Linda glanced toward Victor. A small movement. But I noticed it, and so did Tom. The sheriff folded his arms, watching carefully. Because this meeting wasn't about environmental protection. It was about preserving control. And everyone in the room was beginning to realize it. The problem for Linda was simple. Control becomes much harder to maintain once people start asking questions. And tonight, a lot of questions were about to be asked. The first one came from the back of the room. A retired teacher named Helen Brooks stood up. If the HOA doesn't own the lake, why have we been paying lake management fees for years? The room immediately erupted into murmurs. Linda Ashford grabbed the microphone. The fees support community environmental initiatives. Grace stepped forward before she could continue. Which initiatives? Linda hesitated. Only for a second. But everyone saw it. The room grew quieter. Grace opened a folder. Because we've reviewed the public financial records, she placed several documents beneath the projector, large enough for everyone to see. Many of the vendors receiving those environmental funds don't exist. The room froze. A man near the front stood up. What do you mean they don't exist? Grace pointed to the screen. These companies have no registrations, no business licenses, no tax records. Another resident frowned. Then where did the money go? Nobody answered. Not immediately. The silence became uncomfortable. Then I placed another document onto the table. A permit application. The same one connected to the hidden pipeline. This permit was filed for water infrastructure tied to Lang Ridge development. Several heads turned toward Victor Lang. For the first time all evening, he looked annoyed, not nervous. Annoyed, like he couldn't believe this conversation was happening. Grace continued. The project received HOA support. The murmurs grew louder. Victor finally stood. This is misleading. His voice was calm, polished, professional, the kind of voice investors trust. Unfortunately for him, evidence doesn't care about presentation. I held up a photograph. The buried pipeline, the access hatch, the serial numbers, the manufacturer plate. This pipeline is connected to Mercer Lake. Several residents leaned forward. Victor folded his arms. That's speculation. No. I projected the sensor data onto the screen. Pressure readings, flow measurements, directional mapping. Years of engineering experience condensed into simple visuals. The room stared. Because numbers don't argue, they reveal. And the numbers revealed water leaving Mercer Lake, straight toward Victor Lang's resort. A woman near the center aisle gasped. We paid drought fees for that? Nobody answered. Because everyone already knew the answer. Yes. The realization moved through the room like a wave. People weren't just angry. They felt betrayed. For years, they'd paid fees supposedly protecting the lake. Meanwhile, the lake had been quietly feeding a private development. Victor stepped forward. This proves nothing illegal. Actually, Sheriff Tom Raines said, it proves quite a lot. Every head turned toward him. Tom placed another folder on the table. County contractor records. He opened it. Inside were permit histories, business registrations, corporate filings. One name appeared repeatedly. Victor Lang. Another appeared almost as often. Linda Ashford. The room fell silent. Not nervous silence. The kind that happens when people begin connecting dots. Then Grace delivered the final blow. She removed a sealed document from her briefcase. This was obtained through a lawful records request earlier today. I hadn't seen it before. Neither had Tom. Grace unfolded it carefully, then projected it onto the screen. The title appeared first. Memorandum of Future Water Access Agreement. The room instantly quieted. My pulse quickened. Grace continued reading. The agreement outlined a future transfer of operational control over Mercer Lake resources, signed by Victor Lang, signed by Linda Ashford, dated 2 months before my uncle died. The room exploded. People stood up. Voices overlapped. Questions flew in every direction. What is that? You were planning to give him the lake? You charged us for this? Linda's face drained of color. Victor looked genuinely worried for the first time. Because this wasn't speculation. This wasn't theory. This was intent. Documented intent. Years of manipulation suddenly made sense. The fees, the inspections, the fake authority, the pressure campaign. Everything pointed toward one goal: control. Control of the water, control of the lake, control of what never belonged to them. Linda rushed toward the microphone. That's being taken out of context. The response was immediate. No, it isn't. The voice belonged to Martha Keene. She stood near the back. Calm, steady, respected. I remember Victor trying to buy access years ago. Several residents turned toward her. Martha didn't flinch. Owen Mercer refused him every time. She pointed toward the screen. So they found another way. The room erupted again. This time there was no stopping it. The narrative had collapsed. Completely. Residents weren't asking whether Linda had lied. They were asking how much she had lied. Tom stepped toward the front. His badge reflected beneath the projector lights. This meeting is being documented. That sentence carried weight. Real weight. The room quieted slightly. Tom continued. Based on the evidence presented tonight, additional investigations will be conducted regarding permits, financial records, and water infrastructure. Victor's jaw tightened. Linda looked like she wanted to disappear. Neither had prepared for this. Neither expected the deed. The pipeline, the financial records, or the agreement. Most importantly, neither expected residents to see all of it at once. The power shift was complete. For years, Linda had controlled the room. Tonight, the room controlled her. As people demanded answers, reporters moved closer. Cameras zoomed in. Questions became headlines. And for the first time since inheriting Mercer Lake, I knew something with certainty. The HOA's empire wasn't cracking. It was collapsing. The only remaining question was how much damage investigators would uncover once they started pulling apart everything hidden behind those fees. Because if Linda Ashford had only been the face of the operation, then the corruption behind her was about to become impossible to hide. Didn't take long. 48 hours after the HOA meeting, investigators arrived. Not one agency, several county auditors, state environmental officials, financial investigators. The first thing they did was freeze access to HOA financial accounts. The second was obtain records tied to the pipeline permits. The third was start asking questions nobody at Lakeshore Estates wanted to answer. Questions backed by subpoenas. Questions backed by documents. Questions backed by evidence. The kind of questions that don't disappear. Grace called me 3 days later. They found more. I was standing on the dock when the call came. What kind of more? The kind that ends careers. That sounded promising. She continued. Several vendor payments were routed through shell companies. Connected to Linda? Connected to Linda and Victor. I looked across the lake. What happens now? The same thing that always happens when paper trails get too long. I smiled. They follow them. Exactly. Over the next few weeks, The story exploded beyond the HOA lake. Local newspapers picked it up first, then regional outlets, then state reporters. Every investigation uncovered something new. Unauthorized transfers. Fraudulent environmental filings. Fabricated consulting expenses. Permit irregularities. The pipeline itself became a centerpiece. Experts confirmed what the sensor data had already shown. Water had been diverted from Mercer Lake, not for conservation, not for community benefit, for commercial development. Exactly what Victor Lang had wanted all along. Control. The HOA offices closed shortly afterward. The sign outside Lakeshore Estates remained standing, but the building behind it sat empty. No meetings, no notices, no threats, no violation letters taped to windshields, just silence. For the first time in years, residents experienced what life felt like without constant pressure. One afternoon, Sheriff Tom Raines stopped by the cabin. He looked more relaxed than usual. Thought you'd want an update. I handed him a cup of coffee. Good news? Very. Tom sat down at the kitchen table. State investigators completed the financial review. And? He smiled. They found enough evidence to move forward. A simple sentence, but one carrying years of consequences. Linda Ashford was charged with fraud, financial misconduct, falsification of regulatory documents, and conspiracy related to unauthorized fee collection. Victor Lang faced charges connected to illegal water diversion, fraudulent permitting, and financial misconduct tied to development activities. Neither charge appeared overnight. Both came from documents. Records, contracts, permits, exactly what my uncle understood all along. Truth survives when it's written down. Months later, the courthouse was packed. Residents filled nearly every seat. Not because they enjoyed legal proceedings, because they wanted closure. For years, they had been told the HOA was untouchable. Now they were watching accountability happen in real time. The evidence spoke for itself. The deed, the financial records, the permits, the pipeline, the HOA agreement. Every piece fit together. One fact supporting the next. The judge didn't need dramatic speeches. The documents were enough. When the rulings finally came, the courtroom remained quiet. Not shocked, not surprised. Relieved. The fight was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded everyone involved. Questions flew in every direction. Most of them focused on the same thing. What happens to Mercer Lake now? The answer mattered, because defeating corruption is only half the job. The other half is building something better. That's why I spent the following months working with Grace, Sheriff Raines, Martha Keene, and several residents. Together, we created the Mercer Lake Conservation Trust. No hidden fees, no secret authority, no private ownership transfers. Everything transparent, everything documented. The trust protected the lake permanently while allowing residents fair access and community involvement. The model attracted attention across the state. People wanted to know how a community nearly lost control of its future and how it got it back. The answer was simple. People stopped accepting claims and started asking for proof. The first public meeting of the trust took place beneath the old pine shelter overlooking the shoreline. Residents attended voluntarily, not because they feared fines, because they cared. Martha chaired the meeting. Grace handled legal oversight. Tom served as liaison with environmental agencies. For the first time, every decision happened in the open. Exactly where it should have been. Late that evening, after everyone left, I walked back to the dock. The same dock where Linda Ashford had slapped violation notices onto my truck. The same dock where this entire fight began. The lake was calm. Families were fishing again. Kayaks moved across the water. Children laughed along the shoreline. Nobody worried about surprise fees. Nobody worried about fake violations. Nobody worried about losing access to something they loved. The lake finally belonged to the truth. Grace joined me, near the railing. Hard to believe how much changed. I nodded. Hard to believe how close they came. She looked out across the water. Your uncle would have liked this. I thought about that for a moment. About the hidden key. The old note. The deed. The years he spent holding the line alone. Maybe he knew someone would eventually finish the fight. Maybe that's why he left the clues. Not to protect the lake forever. Just long enough for the truth to surface. The last light of the day reflected across the water. Quiet. Steady earned. And standing there, watching Mercer Lake finally free from the people who tried to profit from it, I understood something my uncle had known all along. They spent 20 years charging people for water they never owned. In the end, it wasn't money that destroyed them. It was the truth written on a piece of paper they thought nobody would ever find.
And I think that's a real lesson here. My uncle didn't win this fight by arguing louder, threatening people, or trying to overpower anyone. What protected that lake was a simple decision he made years earlier. He kept the record, reserved the truth, and trusted the facts would matter when the time came. When everything else became confusing, fees, accusation, pressures, and false claims, the one thing that held steady was the evidence. That's something worth remembering, whether it's your land, your home, your family history, or simply your good name. The truth may not move fast, but it has a way of lasting longer than fear. Sometimes staining your brow doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, and refusing to give up on what's right. Now I'm curious about you. If you ever had to stand your ground in a situation where you know you were right, type yes in the comment. And if you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where paperwork and up telling the real story, drop a justice in the comments. And genuinely like to hear your experience. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people showing quiet courage, protecting what's there the right way, and finding answers through persistence instead of anger, consider subscribing. There are plenty more HOA, rent, and land price stories ahead, and I'll be glad to help you along for the journey.